Yo, yo. What is good? Okay, so hope you enjoyed that little horrorscape. That was some shit I made with Contact a while back. Just a bunch of granular samples and then all the stuff just like stretched out, glitched out inside of Contact. Okay, so compression. Who is ready for compression? Ready to compress compression theory into their brains so they can finally understand it. Not I, sir. I am not ready. That's how I imagine you just said that. Okay, so compression, what is it? We already talked about like a couple different just like theories about how to think about compression and analogies. Like the grandma analogy is pretty good. So grandma is the compressor, and every time you turn it up, the compressor, grandma, how fast she turns it down is how fast the compressor compresses the signal. So that is what compression is in a nutshell. So how a transient develops over time. So an envelope. So there's a ton of stuff that kind of allows us to kind of like, I guess, control the transient. There's transient designers, which I actually didn't include in this week's um, actual discussion because I think, in my personal opinion, transient designers are the easy mode of compression. And so transient designers should really be used, I guess, in addition to good compression techniques. Because once you control the development of a sound and how it actually changes in dynamics over time, because another goal of compression is to level out the signal, not just shape the envelope, but getting a consistent envelope. So transient designers are definitely easy mode. Anything that has less than, I guess, 4 knobs is easy mode. When you get into hardware type of, control, like dynamics and, say, like a distressor, which is like a compressor slash distortion unit, those are single knob, but their functionality is what you're paying for. So a lot of those hardware modules are, designed with that in mind that it will be just the flavor that somebody wants to put on like just everything. And when I worked at Fantasy Studios, that's pretty much their go-to for pretty much every instrument. Is like, how can we get some type of distressor going through, and then they would have a couple just separate racks just full of distressors. So, I mean, on top of that theory that I just talked about, a distressor is also a saturator. Um, so, saturation, tube distortion is also compression. That is a form of natural compression. Natural compression is different from digital or forced compression, where it's forcing it into an envelope shape. There's two basic ways to compress a signal. There is peak compression and RMS leveling, bus compression, or um, just overall averaging. So just leveling of an average signal as opposed to carving every single envelope. So I mapped out every single, key term here just to kind of like make it very clear on how this works. And we're going to talk about this in a second here. Because this right here, this is why I started here. This is the most confusing thing about compression. So that's why I'm not talking about transient designers, because this has nothing to do with the transient designer. You do not control any of this stuff with the transient designer. The transient designer is an envelope shaper, a very, very, very good envelope shaper that reads incoming envelopes and says, hey, turn up the peak, reduce the amount of sustain. And so those are two individual goodizer knobs that do exactly what they say, but there's a ton of other processing that goes into it in order to actually make it good, including the triggering of that module. So transient designers across the board will have some type of like if they're updated, including the transient master from Native Instruments also has MIDI input now. So you can make sure that every single time, say like from your kick or something like that, it receives MIDI information to trigger the transient designer every single time. Okay, so just making that very clear that we're not going to be talking about transient designers, but I'm very aware that they exist. But to expand on top of that, the single one good knob plugins. So like thinking about sausage fattener or OTT or vitamin from Waves, if anybody uses that. That's something a lot of engineers use, like OTT. That's the like high-end version of OTT, is vitamin from Waves. And other types of multi-band dynamic compressors with limiting built in. Say the ML4000, if anybody knows or remembers Mic DSP plugins, those used to be a really big thing. But they were pretty much like OTT, where they had expansion and compression built into one multi-band compressor. So it was just crushing everything, and then on top of that, which OTT does not have, is a built-in limiter that is threshold based, not gain based into a clipped ceiling. Similar to what people like to argue is better than actual mastering limiters, say with soft clip on a glue compressor. They're like, oh, I get that shit louder. It's only louder because you're clipping, literally. You're hitting 0 and you're clipping off and you're getting a little bit more amplitude because you're actually not compressing the sound as much as you would. Say if somebody doesn't know how a limiter works, doesn't know how mastering works, then you're smashing everything into a master thinking, how come I can't just clip everything and make it sound good? What step am I missing here? Why can't I just put a fucking Pro L2 on my shit and make it sound loud? And why does the glue compressor sound better? Well, a ton of other things going on there inside of a Pro L2 than there is with a glue compressor. Because glue compressor, again, just a clipper. So if you're thinking about FL Studio stock compared to Ableton stock, you have the Fruity limiter and the clipper. So people like to put the clipper on top of their master, and it gets them louder because they're adding a ton of distortion, and that distortion adds compression. So Fruity Clipper is the same thing as Sausage Fattener, as the same thing as Sound Goodizer. So Sound Goodizer is like a combination of limiting, like gooder limiting, if we're just going to use their terminology, gooder limiting with gooder saturation. So it sound gooderizes it when you turn it up, kind of like sausage fattener, where it adds saturation plus compression plus limiting. But those are all wideband compression and similar to like a glue compressor. So now just stepping away from what I think you guys already know about compression, which is how to smash it together, how to make it loud, how to smash it together, how to smash it, and then how to smash it. And then when you're smashing it, you can go and smash it. Then after you're done smashing it, maybe you should smash it. Maybe 10 times. Fuck it. Just put a compressor on there. Duplicate it, Command D, as many times as you can until your chain just like has no more space. And then put all that in a group and then duplicate it. Fuck it. So, like, all that stuff, compression, if you overuse compression, it will make distortion. Bottom line. So, everybody that just goes and smashes OTTs together and gets it loud, what you're doing is you're adding hard clipping. Hard clipping, digital clipping. if you want to just be very, very literal about what you're doing. Not saying it's wrong, just saying that's what you're doing. Okay, so now let's take a step back from that. What does it all really mean when I'm using a compressor and when I'm talking about ratio, threshold, and applying these to the actual signal? So that's really crucial knowledge, just to be able to load up a compressor. Like, I didn't include a huge outline of Pro C because Pro C is not Pro C2, so Pro C2 is the new one. There's a ton of extra shit in Pro C2, but Pro C is very functional in itself. If anybody just has Pro C for now, Pro C2 came out post the big, pack release, so you kind of have to buy that on its own. But yeah, Pro C is really good still, and honestly, a compressor is a compressor. The only thing that makes it different from another one is coding, literal DSP, if it's actually saying what it's doing. So if it's doing what it's saying it's doing, then you should be able to do the same exact effect on a high-end Waves compressor inside of an Ableton or any other stock compressor. 0% of that stuff that's like zero latency is different. It's just, how accessible is its UI, really? That's really the big difference. FabFilter is probably the most accessible because they have the most summed up and clean UIs, in my opinion. Okay, so yeah, we're going to talk about expansion as well, and sidechaining, and gating, because these are all related. Why? Because they share the same terms. They all share these same functions. So when you use a gate, you have a threshold, you have a ratio, you have, a floor, a ceiling, similar things to what would be in a limiter. And we're not going to really talk about limiting today, but we're going to be talking about using a compressor as a limiter because all limiters are compressors. Limiters are built to have one very specific function: how to smash it, make it loud, and maintain master quality, which is fix all intersample peak errors and everything else that can happen down the line when it's getting downsampled. Okay, so why is compression different from expansion? Can anybody tell me, in their own words, really quick, in the chat, what makes expansion different from compression? It should be really easy, simple, one word. Yep. Alright, so I got it. Expand, go up, make bigger. Compress, go down. Yep. Yep. From the noise floor. Expansion raises the noise floor. Yes. Okay, so those are all correct. And they're literally describing which direction this dynamic quality is being pushed. So when something goes over the threshold on a compressor, it reduces. So it's subtractive. Subtractive dynamic processing. So with an expander, if we're talking about an expander based in a compressor, which is now called upwards compression, then it goes and multiplies the transient when it passes the threshold. Okay, so then I'm just going to explain it, and then we're going to have to, I might have to edit these guys too. Whoopsie, forgot to pee. But yeah, so I'm gonna re-explain this when we go back into it. But talking about compressors, so downwards compression is when something passes the threshold and it reduces dynamic range. Upwards compression is when it passes the threshold and it multiplies that peak. Upwards compression. So now expansion. Expansion is different because now we're talking about anything below the threshold. So we are talking about the noise floor. So expansion controls the noise floor. It says anything below this threshold, bring it up to the threshold. So that's upwards expansion. And then downwards expansion says anything below the threshold, reduce its dynamic range. So it's taking the noise floor and pushing it down farther. So it's not saying past the threshold, it's saying anything below it. Anything below that threshold gets pushed down farther. So if you load up any of those multiband dynamics presets, not OTT presets, because that's what it's called. It's not the OTT plugin from Ableton. So reduce ambience, that preset is downwards expansion. Because it's saying anything below this threshold, pull it down. Upwards expansion, push it up to the threshold. Exactly. So compression expansion is talking about on what side of the threshold are you affecting dynamics. But both directions apply to both sides of the threshold. So that's why it's confusing. So then there's 4 types of compression. 4 types of main compression. There's upwards and downwards compression, and then there's upwards and downwards expansion. Why does that help us understand stuff? Because when I'm using this is downwards compression. This is upwards compression. When it's blue, it's up. When it's orange or whatever color you have your appearance set to, it is downwards. When we're talking about expansion, exact same thing. So when using the ratio in that sense, it's a little bit harder to wrangle it in, but that's one of those things you can really fine-tune to taste, especially because expansion is a very hyper form of compression, meaning it's going to just kind of blow up the transient a lot and really give it just a lot of quality to it. Straight to the John Casey beats, bro. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of these terms here, because we're going to be talking about the compressor. So you should kind of know how this compressor works already. It's really, really simple. So we have, just going into the actual compressor, and you have that outline to look on. This is our threshold. So it's a negative dB amount by default. We can plus 6 to the threshold, but if you really need it, you shouldn't be pushing that hot into the input anyways. Let's just close this down for the moment. And there's different, gens of this compressor specifically. I don't believe the 8 compressor works anymore. I think they got rid of that. But that really, that was a feedback compressor, so it had an ability to expand using feedback compression. Does it still work on 10? Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Like, I haven't used it in a minute. And last time somebody told me they were trying to wrap it, same way they were doing prior, like, I think just 10.1 point something. It wasn't working anymore. But if it still works in the latest update, then good to go. Can probably talk about that at another point. Just the difference between a feedback compression and stuff like that. But yeah, okay, so it's talking about some of the theory here. And these loops are probably way too much for what I want to do right now. Let's go to something a little bit chiller. A little bit chiller. I go straight to Footwork Jungle. My idea of chill is a lot different than most people. Alright, so talking about thresholds. So set the threshold wherever the peak value that you want to reduce that peak to. So, I give the example in here, and this is direct from this description here. So, again, threshold, the negative dB value in which dynamics processing it will start taking place. So it will start happening. And is also the value in which the compressor / expander and gate will process to. So gate has a couple extra functions that are telling it what to do, but the threshold still applies in gate because it's saying anything below this threshold, cut off immediately. So ratio is the divisor. So it's saying reduce to 1. So that's what it's saying. It's saying reduce to 1 over 1. So when we talk about how much dB to subtract, we're talking about reduce this value plus 3 dB over the actual threshold. So divide that peak value by 3. So that means if we have a threshold set to neg 12 dB and our peak is at neg 9 plus 3 dB, then if we set our ratio to 3 to 1, then it will reduce the signal to 11 dB. Why not 12? Why is it not reducing it to neg 12? I forgot that neg. So, can anybody tell me why it wouldn't reduce this signal to 12? Trick question. I already have the answer right here. Because if it does reduce it to 12, then it's limiting. It's becoming a brick wall. It's saying that anything above this threshold, cut it off. That's a limiter. Infinite ratio. Yeah. So that means anything plus 10. So plus 10 plus 20, you're now getting into limiting. So what a limiter is it's a ceiling. It says run into this threshold and then either push up to 0 or cut it off. So there's two types of limiters. We have a threshold-based limiter and a gain-based limiter. Threshold says push up to 0, whereas gain-based says push into 0. Yes, so just those two, basically dividing to get to 0. So you're dividing the amount of info. So that's why this is like a huge amount of DSP and signal processing. Both the same thing. That was a little bit redundant, but it literally is telling the data to divide. So there's a lot of calculations going on. Okay, so what does this mean though? This is the template that you should be thinking in your head if you're trying to be very, very specific on where to keep your peaks at. So when you're talking about like live band compression and snares and drums and all that type of stuff, you do want your, processing to be very consistent. You don't want it to be all of a sudden super loud just because the drummer hit it loud. You want the compression to work harder when he plays it louder. So it sounds louder, gives you more impact, but doesn't hurt you physically. So you don't want it to go and actually peak plus the rest of the mix because that's unbalanced. You want it to add to the timbre, compress harder. So that means that if you did, like if your incoming signal was ideal at neg 12, that's really the roadblock here, or I guess roadmap even. So roadblock being like if you don't know where to start, you don't even know what to do with the compressor. So if you don't know what this ratio means, you don't even know what to do with it. You're just turning it up because higher numbers equal better in the basic understanding of anything. And I'm speaking from experience on that, being like when I started, using compressor, which is like 14, 15, I had no fucking clue what I was doing. I would just turn that shit up because that's what I did on everything I did. I would just turn it all the way up. So I was in the Spinal Tap. And I was like, does it go to 11? And I was just trying to do that on everything. And a lot of people, they get their own flavor by doing that. So, I forgot the Y here. Divisively. So meaning that we can be more specific with how we're going to apply that stuff. So, you know, if we want it to be at neg 12 and our snare transient is this long, then this is how fast we want to compress that signal when it passes that threshold. So if we have peaks that are, you know, say in our drum track, we have peaks that are +6 over neg 12. So at neg 6, then we might want to set the threshold to 5 to 1 or 6 to 1. So we meet right in the middle between that highest peak. So we can't always be 100% specific with the compressor. So the compression does need to be natural and live. So this is like kind of a, I guess, roadmap to start on when wrangling in that audio. So in EDM, you don't really have that problem as much. But when you're working with breaks and other things, you know, you tend to need to have some type of control over the sound. Because when you go and start to apply this stuff, you can actually use your attack and release to design the transient after that. How fast to reduce that signal. Say if all your peaks were around neg 6, but your actual transient was at like neg 3, and then your sustain was at like neg 6, and you wanted more transient, less sustain, then you can back off the attack, compress. So say if your sustain was happening, and we'll do this and apply it literally, but just conceptually right now, if our sustain of our snare drum is happening at 20 milliseconds, and the peak value of that is around, peak meaning post-transient, where that dB value is of the sustain, is around, say, you know, like neg 12, neg 15, and our peak is at neg 6, then we're going to want to set our threshold to way below neg 6. We want to go and put it at neg 15, neg 16. And then back off the attack so it passes, it lets the transient pass through, and then compresses that sustain and says, hold it down here. We can even reduce farther and go neg 20 on the threshold to go and back it off and pull down the sustain. And then the release will tell us how long to hold it down. If that sustain is exactly 50 milliseconds plus that 15 to 20 milliseconds for the transient, then that's about 40, 35 milliseconds total. So then we should set our release time to about 30 to 40 milliseconds. So we're literally splitting up the envelope into different sections and saying, I want to compress here, I want to reduce it longer here. And so, like, if you understand this, then you can make your own transient designers with any compressor, and you can be a little bit more specific with it. Okay, so now knee peak value and RMS, root mean squared. So these all have something to do with each other because our knee, that is creating a curve. It's saying once it passes the threshold and starts compressing, this is the shape in which it compresses. So now back to grandma. So if grandma had cat-like reflexes and was just like whoosh, just like within a second was jarring. It's like no, psh, and it just like snapped. That would be a hard knee. But if it was a soft knee, grandma would be like, she'd look at you and just, you know, softly just go over and turn it down, all passive aggressively and shit. So want to keep that analogy going. I'm not saying that transient designers are bad. I'm saying that if you know what you're doing with compression, you can do the same thing. And this is kind of all leading to like processing 110, where I'm talking about specifically processing specific types of signals to kind of line up with 110 synth and 110 sampling, where we're making specific sounds, sampling specific stuff. Yeah, so it's really just like, you know, what do you gain from a transient designer? So I like Alloy and Neutron because they give me multi-band transient designing. So that's one selling point for that. You know, so I really like that stuff. Whenever I think of multi-band, I think of phase problems. So I want something that lines up phase and keeps it nice and allows me to go and split that signal and do that. So that's a huge selling point for that. Just phase alignment in general. All right, so knee is going to be the shape of that curve. Peak value, we talked about this already. So each peak as it happens in real time. And these are settings for a lot of compressors. So RMS, root mean squared, is the averaging of the sound, giving you a generalized value to work with NC. So say if your peak value was around -3, then your RMS would probably be around -6 to -9. So depending on the overall power between your transient and your sustain. So it averages those two values. Those two values I just told you that you can affect specifically. So now your DAW or your A to D converter is looking at those two values and creating an average mean between both, which is also the same thing as LUFS. Yeah, so Neutron is a really good one. I like Neutron. I also like LA2. LA2 is a little bit more snappier. It's a little weirder. So I keep that one around just for shits and giggles. All right, so now let's get into compressors. So let's actually do some compression and shit. So we talked about all these functions. We talked about the ratio. We talked about the threshold. We talked about attack and release and what all those things do. And we talked about RMS signal now. So that means you should be an advanced compressor user now. And so I can just go straight into mastering class. And you can get exactly what you want right now. Just kidding. Haha. Alright, so I'm going to open this up. We're going to kind of look at each different value here. So we got our meter readout, which this is a basic thing that you see on a lot of compressors. On most compressors, they'll combine all three of these readouts in one nice readout, kind of like the Pro C, where we can see our envelope shape, which is going to be, this is the general one. This is the one you see if you don't see either of these two. But technically, this one is combined with this. And then we see our envelope readout. I'm just going to take this really high-pitched kick. Okay, so we can see our envelope. We can see that there is compression happening because we have 2-to-1 set, which is our most basic and most, I guess, lenient form of compression here. So when you're talking about, like, you know, when to be more exaggerated with your ratio and when to be a little bit softer, and then if you pull this below, well, you can actually pull this below on this guy, but you can in other ones. Other ones will allow you to go and turn this into an expander. But in here, you have two different versions, or three. Okay, so attack is right here, release is right here, so that's all simple. So when we're setting our actual compression, I like to kind of know how it develops in time already. So you can look in here to see some of our value. Or zoom in on the timeline. So this is milliseconds down here. So we got 20 milliseconds and about 60 is its overall arc of transient. This is something that I usually will just kind of like fine-tuned by ear. It's not something that I will go and sit down while I'm producing and go and calculate. This is something while I'm mixing, I will calculate. Sit down and calculate this because I like to be very precise with it. Allows me to really carve out extreme mixes, you know, and get shit super loud. And more than half the time, I have to go and decide to do a quieter master. Because most of my masters end up coming out to be like neg 2 LUFS or neg 3 LUFS. And I just like, I'll do that for some stuff that just needs to be balls to the wall, but for other things I'll just pull it back to about neg 5, neg 6. Yeah, just a casual flex there, I guess. But, you know, it's really just like knowing how to mix and knowing how to hyper compress because I come from metal, you know. So that's where I've learned a lot of my techniques on how to mix. It's how to mix for metal. And so I've been, you know, blasting up blast beats for like plus 10 years since high school. So having a ton of shit I used to do back then, yeah, I still do a lot of that shit now. You know, it's just now I can be like, alright, well, I'm not going to do that on that. But I'll do on that. Which is like, if I want my snare to just boop you right in the eardrum, I'll go and do some hyper compression. Maybe multi-band compression as well in order to blast up certain parts of the frequency. So there's like a ton of different things. Yeah, hyper compression literally was developed for metal. And it was something that engineers coined to describe what they had to do in order to mix that music. So it was using a compressor the way it shouldn't have been used, but is capable of doing. So, you know, that doesn't mean that you have to use these things the way they're described in using. You can be as expressive and experimental as you want. But mixing wise, like there's a lot of stuff you have to do in order to actually really make things pop and like get through the mix. This is one of them, which is being able to know that this is about 20 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds for this transient, because this is the, you know, body of the kick, and this is the transient right here. Even though this is quieter, this is a higher frequency. So this is actually our transient of the kick, whereas this is the body of the kick. So if I want to go and cut this off, and shape it around this, maybe even give more life to this, then I'm going to have to compress after about 10 milliseconds around there. So let's kind of put that in practice. Alright, so this shit's super loud already. I definitely like stuff to be like a couple dB below peaking when I'm going into my processing chain. So it's a little bit hard to read where this peak is, but we can easily see it on our meter threshold. So inside of Ableton now, this is new with 10. That's enough. We have two values, and the darker value is peak, whereas the lighter value is RMS. So our peak is around neg 3. So that means that the RMS or sustain of the signal is around about neg 15, neg 16, around there. So I can kind of go in between neg 3 and neg 15, which would be around 9, about here. And this is something I would fine tune to taste. I usually go and drop this threshold right in between my peak value and my RMS value. Yeah, exactly. To what ZeroTep just said. You can always highlight the timeline to get the exact measurements of the attack for your attack and release. So yeah, you definitely want to, you know, just keep that in mind, just to know your overall time value. So then my time value over here, I can set it to about 15 milliseconds. So now that I have these two values set, I'm going to set it to about 45, 50 milliseconds. I can go into either this value, which allows me to go and reduce So how much do I want to reduce this signal? So if the peak value is around -3, I'm going to set the threshold anywhere below that. So if we start in values of 3, so if it's at -3, go to 6. This will reduce it to 5. Well, I can start at a ratio of 3, and then I can pull back in increments of 3. Why do I do this? Because the human ear hears dynamic change in increments of 3 dB. So I do changes when I'm working with EQs and compressors based off 3 because of that fact. And this is something I've learned from, I believe, Bobcat's mastering book. And I've recommended that pretty much every class. Oh yeah, and to Mary, yeah, this is exactly that. So, and to Zero Tep's point, 3 dB is the exponential doubling. So there is an actual algorithm to that as well. So our ears are fine-tuned to hear that, and we have coded and made DSP function in the way it does because of that. But also calculus and mapping, all that stuff is based on the natural progression of those, I guess, kind of laws, you know. So, and yeah, exactly to Vitor Music's point as well. It's the exact same principles as miking when you're talking about even setting up your monitors. Always equilateral triangle, at least 3 feet apart. If you want to go and create a phase, accurate miking setup for your drums, you have to have 3 feet between each section, really. So if you have your tom mics, those tom mics can all be one specific type of mic. They have to be kind of different. They can all be 57s. But if they're isolated, then it's easier. it's a whole other thing. Let's step back from the specific mics and just talk about the overheads. Because the overheads give you the general vibe, which I say would be like the monitors. And those need to be at least 3 feet apart. If they're not, you will get phase misalignments. So you do need that to be a thing. So, all right. So that's where I start pretty much. And it's a good spot to start. So I can double that subtraction by going up to a value of 6. So if I set my threshold, because it's at, the peak value is at -3, and set it at 9, that should reduce it down to -4, around there. So it's going to be less. So I want to go and give myself a little bit more than that. Double it. Double it on the ratio, double it on my threshold. So it is confusing, and I know that y'all are confused. I'm not seeing it in the chat, but I can just feel it. So let's take a step back. My peak value is at -3. You just want to go and kind of make that 1-to-1 ratio connection. When I go and subtract dynamics, I can divide the specific amount plus that threshold and pull it back to +1 dB. So if my peak is +6 on my threshold, I set the ratio to 6, it will reduce the peak down to, if it's -3 here, and I set it to -9, it'll be -8, around there. Alright, so reduce it to 1. Divide it. 6 divided by 6 is 1. It is not 0. 6 divided by 0 is 0. 0 is a fucking crazy number, dude. When they introduced zero, there it was like fucking Y2K for our brains. It's like, all right, so do we exist anymore, dude? Like, be real, Newton. Are we? Like that was the first introduction to the simulation. There's like, whoa, okay, dude. So like, if we divide by zero, like, will Earth exist anymore? Yeah. So even when you're talking about compression, zero is crazy. There is no zero here. If you use zero, you're limiting. It's not compressing for transient design anymore. You're compressing for your final cup. Exactly. Our brains can literally not really understand zero because our brains, if we're a computer, we're always one because we're on. So if we're not one, then we're zero, off. So it's like that's not doesn't compute. You kidding? Negative values? Nah, bro. I don't get it. So yeah, to dial back the confusing discussion right now, always reduce to one. That's what you're thinking about. My peak is at neg3, and I want to reduce to 1 plus 1 over my threshold, and I set the threshold at neg9. I want to go and set it to a ratio of 6. Yeah, bro. Life is just a fucking series of zeros and ones. It's just like a complacent computer program. Alright, so neg9, reduce it by a ratio of 6. So gain reduction wise, we're not getting that much. Mainly because I am backing off my attack. So I can pull the attack back because remember this is actually less than 10. So about 5. Ah. Just like, why is it so loud still? Because of that. Alright, so that's something you want to make sure that's off. If you're trying to be specific with it, makeup gain is a default thing. So it's basing your gain reduction, GR, gain reduction, how much gain you're subtracting, and pushing it up by that amount. Alright, so if I really want to just hear the transient, yeah, definitely. I'll definitely like add on some extra like spatial effects as well. So if I really just want to hear the transient though, pull down the threshold to the RMS value. So now I'm hearing mostly transient. I'm reducing about, say that's about 6 dB right there. 6 to 5 dB right now because I backed it off so far. I can limit, push it up to infinity. Now I'm hyper compressing. So this is what a transient designer does. So this is for transient designing, not to shape and level the audio. So remember, I was saying reduce it to 1. So if my threshold is like way below that shit, then I'm gonna want to go to like a ratio of 6 or 9 in order to kind of wrangle that transient in. Okay, so let's apply this to more stuff now, not just a single kick, just so you can guys like just so you can see like a bunch of different ways to see this, because I know this is super confusing still. And yeah, before we get into like spatial effects and stuff, and I totally feel what you're talking about. So remember increments of 3. So if I really want to level out that transient, then I'm going to push it to 9, not to 60. So this is probably the worst thing about this compressor, right here, the makeup gain. It literally should not be on by default because it doesn't really calculate gain reduction very well. It's calculating gain or makeup gain very well because it's calculating based on your threshold value. So it's actually turning it up whenever you pull this down just by default, not calculating it based off of your like overall gain reduction, which really is more of like a high-end waves thing or anything like that. Okay, so now let's apply this to something that's not exactly transient based, because this I can do with, so like audio leveling, that's something you kind of want to do with like a glue compressor because it's a little bit more gentle and you can throw a lot of stuff through it and it will kind of average all those signals out because by default it's working on the RMS signal. So when you work with peak values, you can go and really shape each transient, meaning limit each transient. So if you're going to go and do any like transient designing, you're going to have to push it to a limiting value because you want to go and reduce the threshold or use the threshold as a reduction and just pull that sustain all the way down to the actual threshold there. So again, when I'm trying to get an average signal, I do the ratio calculation. Glue compression is really good for drums. We're talking about vocals. Let's talk about some vox. Well, these are already super compressed.
Taken. Gotta give it. Your dirty lie.
Oh god.
Hey. Amazing.
No.
Okay. Can you? Ooh.
Actually, I know a good acapella.
Smile.
So a lot of these like older Motown ones, they don't have as much like harsh compression. So they have a lot more natural transients and movement in the sound and stuff. So I kind of like to use these, just to go and like reprocess them and do a lot of stuff to them. For example, like auto-tune.
Let me tell you, the truth is in the eyes, cause let me tell you, the truth is in the eyes, cause let me tell you, the truth is in the eyes, cause let me tell.
Okay, so in this situation we have, vocals.
Let me tell you, the truth is in the eyes, cause let me tell you.
So there's going to be a lot of other moments in this sample where she's not like whispering into the mic.
Beware of the beware faces, smiling faces, faces tell us, and I got faces tell lies.
Okay, so this is a good example right here because we have this average signal and then we have this peak that kind of comes in a little bit more hot. I can even exaggerate that just a little bit. Let's push this up by a couple dB. So if I want everything to be averaged around here, and I don't want to use glue compression because I want it to like actually have a little bit of punch to it. So this is when we're trying to accentuate exactly to what your Vitor is saying there. You know, the peak of the transient. But for something that's not like a transient designer, I wouldn't use a transient designer on a vocal. I would want to use something that's a little bit more generous and a little bit softer. So going to start with a ratio of 3.
Tell lies, and I got tell lies, and I got tell lies, and I got tell lies.
Get a longer stretch of audio here.
Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof.
So we have this peak that comes in here, and I pushed it up by a couple dB. So what I want to do, how I'm being specific with my compression here. Our peak is around here.
Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof.
So now we have an extra 2 dB on top of that. So I can set my threshold a little bit below my first peak.
Smiling faces tell lies.
That's at -3. I'm going to set it down to -6.
Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof. Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof. Smiling faces tell lies, and I got.
So our result signal is being subtracted by about, 2 to 4 dB. I can push it up just a little bit more so it's a little bit more level with that first section.
Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof.
So on this, because it's a overall power thing, it's happening constantly, kind of like a sub bass or a bass line in general. And this is something I definitely do with like compression on those as well, is how to level those out in between their different sections, but also not sound limited. I want them to sound natural and breathe. So, definitely want you guys to have like a very general overview of like where to apply this and how to be specific with it. So drum compression is probably the most exaggerated compression out of all of them. So keep that in mind. When you're using compressors for drums, just go all out. Try things, be exaggerated with the ratio. But say if I went and limited this.
Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof.
It kind of like smashes the dynamic range of this sound now. So I want to keep the dynamic range intact. And that is the idea with compression, is you want to keep the dynamic range live, but you don't want to smash it. So if you wanted to smash this, it'd be a good idea to use it as a parallel compressor, because you can have one extremely smashed version of the vocal adding this constant power in the background, now being distorted because it's being smashed so hard. And let's look at that distortion.
Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof.
So anytime you have a line redraw, and I mapped out that actual definition inside of the outline, but a line redraw that has a bunch of small peaks and valleys in between it, and not a perfectly drawn, redraw curve, which should look like a perfect line. It shouldn't look like all these little peaks and valleys. That's distortion. So every time you do that on a Pro L, you are distorting, but there are ways to push into that correctly. So you want to gain up into the limiter and not use the limiter's gain knob to gain up. That should be a final tipping point in all cases.
Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof. Says, smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof. Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof.
Alright, so there's a little bit of movement on here, but now the line is being smoothed over. So when there's a lot of random movement, and say even with a vocal or a bass, this is where we have this auto button. So the auto button allows us to have an auto snapping release curve.
Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof.
So it can be adaptive. Why? So it can be adaptive. So you want to adapt to that next release curve that's coming in, because all the words and melodies that come in are going to be for different lengths. They might have different emphasis. Kind of like this line here, where it's, you know, goes into the run about smiling, and then he gets loud on that first one. So that's a really easy way to go and kind of like level out a sound, you know, and keep it generally together. I believe I have some live drums samples. This one's super good. This is the fucking John Bonham kit. I don't know if anybody likes Led Zeppelin, but the John Bonham, when the levee break, is extremely good. Alright, so how's compression already smashing this? It's literally limiting this sound already. So this is already being limited. And you can see that because the peaks are exactly the same value. It's being limited, I'm pretty sure, naturally, with like some type of tube compressor, because we can see there are some like valleys here. It's not completely clipped off, although at some points it is. So this is what your peaks look like when you hit 0. So we don't have as much control over this. But how would I want to go and like control this sound? I might want to control the transient. I might want to go and control that actual background sound. Let's get the compressor on the right track here. Alright, so this is where we can get into hyper compression again, go above 5, 6, and start to get into 10 land. Okay, so now I'm limiting hard. I'm going to go look in the timeline, see how long my transients basically are. There's my transient. Has a ton of verb in it. So about 20 milliseconds. So I'm going to push this to about 20. Just because that's a lot of body. And then how long is the tail? About 500 milliseconds. But I do want it to come back up onto that transient. Okay, so now that I'm done hyper compressing it, just smashing it, put the threshold down to infinity, I'm going to go and set my threshold. And I can dial this back as well. The release time is going to be affected by your threshold as well, so keep that in mind. This is our output, this is our gain reduction line. So I don't want it to like bounce up and down like that. I want to find a nice sweet spot in between those two sounds before I go and push it back up with makeup gain. Alright, so now I'm just going to put on the auto release because we have the snare transient, which I want to accent out of this. I want to get that snare transient and I want to get the room nicely mixed together. So I'm subtracting a ton of dB from this. Gain reducing about 10 dB plus neg 12. So then I can push the output by that amount if I want, which at this point, since it's hyper compressing it, I'm going to want to go in between 10 and about 7. That's where I'm going to kind of keep it. And if I wanted to go and make sure that it doesn't clip, I drop a glue compressor on after it. Maybe just put a soft clipper. And then also limit it again. So I can give it a very general compression curves. Auto release again, 2 to 10. So we have a general kind of like vibe here. And then also, we don't have a selection between RMS and peak value. I pretty much want to just put a cap on there where it's not going to go and like get too hot on that snare, because the snare is really poppy right now. But notice that I'm giving new life to this sample. You know, because before, each transient was exactly the same value. Now the snare is getting a little bit more breathing room. If I go and print this or just freeze it without it, we can just kind of check out what that transient looks like now. So look at all the reduction I've done to the space. And I've accented the snares. So I've given life back to this really smashed sample with compression. And that was through using those techniques I just talked about, because that's literally how I go about doing stuff. You know, I start with something that's going to be leveling, general sustain, general dynamics, by keeping dynamic range with the very gentle calculated ratio to threshold relationship. If I want to maintain dynamic range, I need to go and calculate that. Also, when working with audio, you got to make sure that it's not already limited. So, you know, that's something you got to keep in mind when you're working with that stuff, because if you don't, you know, work with like live audio and you're just an EDM producer or producing stuff like that, you know, with like samples or whatever, synthesized stuff, you're going to have a perfect transient every single time. So you're not going to really have to worry about this, you know, general kind of type of compression we're doing here. But Now you can be very, 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 very specific on exactly how you want to compress a sound, because you now have the perfect transient every single time it hits. And when I started producing EDM, this is what really blew my mind about it, was that I didn't have to like mix too hard anymore. Like with live production, there's such a process to it that if you don't do editing, you don't do phase relationships, if you don't do all this extra prep, once you sit down to mix, like your shit's just gonna sound bad by default. There's nothing you can do with your plugins to make it better. You have to go and edit it. You have to go and clean it up. So in EDM or electronic music production, you don't have that step. You have more options to be exaggerated. Hence why it's all loud. Especially with hip hop. Hip hop created the loudness war with, Tupac and Biggie trying to put out louder tracks every single month. Just Biggie would make some louder, Tupac would make it louder, Biggie would make it louder. So eventually they were all the way at zero. And the only person beating them at that point was Iggy Pop. So hyper compression is a result of that. And now in pop music, the general LUFS range for pop music is about -6. That's super, super, super fucking loud for pop music. Because -6 is where I decide to go and drop my tracks. And I'm thinking this is quiet, for my shit. But I'm also comparing my shit to Moody Kid. And he's dropping shit at like -1.5. So, there's different levels of, what's going on there. Actually, Zerotep shared that list with me at one point, and there's a whole list of like the loudest albums and tracks in existence. Skrillex used to be up there, still is, but now it's Moody Kid and Iggy Pop. They're the reigning champs of the loudness war. The generals, if you will. Purple hearts and everything. Okay, so compression. Step back again. What are we talking about? What's it doing? Ratio. Reducing to 1. Reducing to 1. Maths. Maths and division. Division and fraction. Subtronics, yeah. Well, honestly, like any rhythm track in general is going to be super loud now. I think Achios has way better mixes than Subtronics. Achios is probably one of my favorite rhythm producers right now. Brought the loudness war back. Nah, dubstep did. Rhythm's always been a thing. Rhythm used to be quiet, yo. I remember when it was called Trench and Tear Out. It was quiet. Like if you don't listen to like Sadu or Dejasta, Megalodon, their shit wasn't super loud. Also Trampa. Trampa's early shit and Trollface was quieter. It was just like you turn that shit up and it was just like super fucking dynamic and just like heavy. Yes, so Miri, to your question, there is a formula. So think of it as a reduced to 1 formula. When you want to maintain dynamic range, so a kind of reduction of general peaks, go and keep that reduced to 1 formula in mind. Now, when you're doing hypercompression, the formula is reduced to threshold. So that's reduced to 0. Hypercompression reduced to 0. Dynamic compression reduced to 1. So that's what you should be thinking about. That's what you should be putting in your mind when you're doing that. So when you're reducing to the threshold or 0, you can just crank that ratio up. Pull down the threshold, fine-tune the attack and release to taste, and then push it back up with your makeup gain or output volume. Makeup gain and output volume are the exact same thing. So now when you go and, say if you were just trying to get a average, glue compression style compression out of the regular compressor, just switch it to RMS mode. And so now it will react to this RMS signal only. Same way it's sidechaining. So it creates a summed data stream of RMS signal and compresses the output by that. So when we talk about sidechaining, I could literally copy this over, reverse it, pitch it up, be like, hey, I like those transients. I want to compress this original sound by a reversed, pitched up version of itself, and then sidechain it back into itself. So I'm getting the compression curve of this different affected audio, but still the same audio. Yes. So what Aya said is a very, very specific formula. So I definitely want to give out a specific formula, but I don't believe there is one way to do it. I believe there are roadmaps. There are places to start, and the first place to start is knowing how your compressor works and how your tool works. So I really just want to nail home what ratio does, attack release, and what they're good for. When we go and start to talk about processing specific sounds, then we can go and start to work on actually mixing with compression. Because a lot of people use OTT in just this very colorizing way, where they're substituting it for many, many steps in their processing chain. And I do that 100% when I'm starting my production, starting my track. I just want to get some hype, throw an OTT on there, get it blasted up, loud. I also refer to it as juicing up what's already there. Refining. Reduction. I made a fruit roll-up production, and then I basted it in turkey. And it's my honey baked ham. But it's fruit roll-ups, mate. I reducted the fruit roll-ups into sugar, and I used it on my ham. And that's why I lost the competition, mate. I guess they just didn't like it. Yes, so we're going to have a whole day on OTT. And we're going to be talking about multi-band compression and all that stuff. So we're doing pretty decent on time right now, just to kind of start talking about a couple other things. I just want to go over what, side chaining is, and just the UI here, and start opening up Pro C. So I'm gonna get just a little drum line going. We're doing 4 on the floor at 200. Not making hard style today. Oops.
Smiling faces tell lies, and I got proof. Smiling faces, and I smiling faces tell, smiling faces.
Okay, so I want to go and sidechain this to my kick. Easy. And I'm sure you all know how to do this. Open up the carrot, sidechain to my drum rack, and I can patch into the specific drum.
Smiling faces tell, 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 smiling faces tell.
Okay, so how do I sidechain? What are you looking for when you sidechain? This is something that a lot of people just don't talk about. So when you're sidechaining, you want to go and create a nice curve. That's my goal when I set up a sidechain. I don't want this curve. Don't want that curve. That curve with all of the jagged movement, that's distortion. I do not want that. Okay, so regardless of where I set this threshold, I'm always going to get that jagged kind of peak. So what I want to do is I'm going to go and, yeah, exactly, use the EQ and either high pass or band pass. Because this kick is very, you know, I guess low mid frequency, there's not really that much higher frequency. I can go and sidechain this to a quarter note hi-hat. I can go inside just to anything that I want to be quarter notes. But if I'm just working with specifically this kick, I want to use a bandpass filter because I want to go and just get that kind of mid frequency. Okay, so I can go and catch that little transient right here, and now I can use the ratio to go and push it down hard. Okay, so I want my envelope to create that redraw. So, actually, good question. Thoughts on linear versus logarithmic? So linear is going to be less of a, there's a lot of ways to refer to this, but it's called prelapse or proximity effect. That's the easiest way for me to describe that. So proximity effect is most prevalent when you use logarithmic. That's why it's default to that. But linear can also be interesting. So this gives me a straighter line. So I like to have my release set to manual because if I do auto, it will go and give me only the release curve of the kick. So I would just want to catch that transient, the peak. I don't want the whole kick. I just want the transient. And then I want to go and calculate my sidechain curve with release. I want to have that done by the compressor. Every time I move the threshold, I get distortion, but each time it settles, it draws that nice line. Alright, so again, I'm using the bandpass filter because I want a little bit of body and length to that kick, but I don't want the whole thing. Because the whole thing is giving me way too much compression. So that's some thoughts about that. When I go and sidechain to my kicks, just in general, for house, I use LFO tool a good majority of the time. But for hip hop, definitely use sidechaining. And I do a different thing using flip gates for my snare sidechains, just because I like that sound. That's a personal thing. I think it's snappier, cuts out the signal. Stuff I would do manually with editing and stuff like that. So when we're doing like a hip hop beat or something like that, you know, you can use sidechaining to lock swing together between your different sections. So I also want to use this as an opportunity now to load up the gate. So gating effects. So obviously it's cutting off the signal below this threshold. We're going to talk about the return and a couple of the other functions here. But we have a sidechain in here as well. So sidechain, turn it on, patch it to my rack again, and then I'm pretty sure I'm doing it to this one. Alright, so now it's only letting the signal through when the snare hits.
Faces tell. Faces.
Okay, so I don't want it to do that. I just want it to cut out signal when that snare comes in.
Falling faces tell. Falling faces tell. Falling faces.
So what is the gain from doing this as opposed to using a compressor? Can anybody tell me what would be happening? Because I haven't described all the functions in the gate yet. But what happens when that gate gets triggered that's different from a compressor? It has to do with a very specific knob I literally just touched and talked about. I'm asking the chat now. What makes sidechaining to a gate different? In this sense, where I'm using the flip mode, which reverses that gating function, meaning signal's always flowing through until it gets chained or gated. Yes, so it's actually taking out the sound. What's it literally doing, specifically? Removing rather than reducing. Yes. Actually taking out the sound, removing, hyper limiting. No. Almost. It's cutting below a specified dB, yes. That's the threshold. It's functioning like a mute button, 1000%. So, everybody that said it's cutting, removing, that is what it's doing. But it's removing to the floor. So it's reducing the sound specifically to this noise floor setting. So I can set it all the way to infinite. And when I do that,
Falling faces tell. Falling faces tell. Falling faces tell.
so I can be a little bit gentle on my kick compression, and then when the snare comes in, I can just pull it all the way out just to hear that transient. So I have tiny little snares that need a lot of space.
Falling faces tell. 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 Falling faces tell.
Okay, so it's kind of a weird thought. Why do I do this? Why do I do this shit? Well, A, for the swing, exactly that. It locks everything together, especially on hip-hop, because I do a lot of movement with my snares. I do not want some kind of like non-locked thing with this. I do want it to have the swing that I'm putting on my snares.
Falling faces tell.
It also gives me like a lot of pull on my beat.
Falling faces tell. 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 Falling faces tell.
So it pulls the beat around. It allows me to lock my different sections together. Sidechaining is huge. So this reduces it down to the noise floor. By this release value, it's going to hold it down there for as long as I hold it down there. Release gives me a value that it logarithmically steps back into existence.
Falling faces tell. 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 Falling faces telling faces, telling faces, telling faces, telling faces, telling.
Yes. So essentially it's muting. Okay, so seeing some questions about gating now, which is great, because now you guys are curious about the gate. The gates are cool. Alright, so really simple though for side chaining. Just turn on flip. It pulls out the sound when it's triggered, as opposed to taking out the sound by default. Anything below the threshold is gone. Now, when the threshold is crossed, it takes out the sound. But because it's being sidechained, sound always flows through it. It just gets pulled out right when the snare comes in. That's it. And yeah, doing it by hand is also a good thing. If you want to go and like do like quarter note stuff or anything like that, if I want to be exaggerated for like one hit, like say if I wanted to be exaggerated right here, definitely do not do it with your track volume, and please do not start that habit. Just don't. It's a waste of time. Huge waste of time. This is something we'll talk about in snapshot automation, but it's called trim automation. This is a very high level technique. It takes a lot of thought to put a utility on something just to reduce it for one little hit. But this allows your track volume to be unlinked. So if I wanted this to just like bevel, utilities for noobs, that's hilarious. But yeah, definitely if you're using your track volume, you're wasting a ton of time. But also, like if you are doing that, just group it, and then you can use your track volume again. But yeah, definitely some noob shit to use your track volume for automation on volume. What about that? So every time you start to automate this, so just for example, you're like, great, I like it like this, blah, blah. And then you're like, oh, time to mix. I'm going to reduce that by 3. Uh-oh, now I need to go and rewrite all of my automation. So don't want to do that. Don't want to be locked into that situation. So you just mitigate that by not doing it at all. Use the utility to automate the volume. If you're going to do a manual sidechain, do it with the utility. Have had to tell that to a lot of people, and including older people, like in their 40s, techno producers who are just like fighting me. It's like, bro, it's not better. You're gaining nothing. It does the same exact thing. All you're doing is creating more work for yourself. Sorry. Okay, so let's talk about gating and how this works. So just like, you know, compressor, below the threshold, it's going to be reduced. So that means that we need to have it set above a certain amount. Actually going to go, put on here. Okay, so now we're working with this. So we have a couple functions. We also have look ahead on our other compressor as well. So what's look ahead? It's a buffer. So it looks ahead in time by 10 milliseconds and calculates that in samples. Once you go and put on look ahead, it adds 10 milliseconds to the sample reduction or sample latency. So that's 10 milliseconds, 441 samples. So keep that in mind when you put that on. Zero latency is not a thing in this unless you set it to 0. So it's pretty good though to use that on a gate because you do really want it to be a little bit generous. So now here, attack is how fast it reduces that signal. Okay, so now we have noise floor where it's going to reduce to. Let's actually take this off as well. Whoops. Alright, so it sounds really jagged and all over the place. So that's not ideal. That's not how it should work either. So now we have this return specifically for that. So return, and here's the hard definition over here. Return reduces the amount of chatter. So it's also called hysteresis, where it rapidly kind of like gives you an extra, I guess, threshold value. So it's saying within 7 dB of neg 17 below, it will still trigger and keep it open. That's doing two things. It's triggering and keeping it open until it crosses this threshold. So if I wanted to reduce the transients now, then I can back off the attack. If you want full transient value, 0 attack. So a good balance in between return, release, and hold will give you a really nice balanced gate. So what am I doing with gate? Reducing ambience, specifically for the transient. So I'm setting the threshold at the transient, telling that gate to stay open for this long. So if we set it at the transient though, then we have the ability to really just trigger it individually. So how would I use the sidechain as an internal EQ, like a pre-gate EQ? So if I wanted to do that, I can patch this to itself. And I can't go anywhere but prefix. But then I can go and high pass, so I'm getting no lower frequencies. Definitely want to keep the higher frequencies in this sound because I have a hi-hat in there as well. Alright, so now I'm literally envelope shaping with this gate. So that's really what you can do with gates. It's envelope shape for joy. Okay, so now let's talk about some Pro C and some Pro G, because these directly kind of relate to what we're talking about here. And then we'll just talk about some OTT to kind of end it out, because we've talked about everything now. And we're going to be filling in these gaps. This is the intro to compression, by the way. This is why I didn't want to introduce compression while we were talking about mixing. Because I want to talk about compression for like 16 weeks straight, really, before I go and introduce all that shit. Okay, so now we're going to get in Fab Filter. I'm going to load up Pro G and Pro C. So now we know what these curves are doing. Now we can see this and be like, below this threshold reduce. Ratio, in this sense, is going to be noise floor. And in most if not all, professional gates. Noise floor is called ratio because it's the reduction curve. So downwards expansion. Exactly to what I was saying, like hyperlimiting. So our range now is that extra little value I was talking about that it reduces the amount of chatter. And my knee can go and smooth out that amount. Now on Ableton, we can sidechain. So I can sidechain this to itself, same way I did with this guy. Ableton new version can sidechain on plugins that have sidechain, which is sick, bro. Stoked. So we have all types of different compressors or gates in here. We have classic, which is the normal. Clean, which is also like classic. I would say it's a little bit more generous. It's not as cutting. Vocal, these they're kind of a little bit more general, but really it's just the time and the knee. So it's giving you a different curve. So it's saying this is better for these things. So it's not really giving you like a gate for guitar. It's saying that this is better for it. Vocal as well. And inside the actual manual, there's a bit about that. So when I get into more complex stuff, I want to talk about that a little bit more. So also notice that the look ahead is off by default. So oversampling is also off. So that means we should have 0 latency. And we do. Bottom left hand corner, we can see 0 samples. So once I add this, add that, 444 samples by 10.1, almost right. Now I can times that by 4. Almost right. Pretty general. So these aren't going to be like crazy mastering versions, and nor would you really want to use a gate on your master. I don't know why you want to do that, but you can do stuff like that. Upwards and ducking are the actual different types of compressors. So upwards gate is now an upwards expansion curve. It's saying at this, turn it up. Turn it up more! So careful. So upwards gating is upwards expansion. So you can use Pro G like an expander too. Now ducking it will reduce anything after this. So it's kind of like a spectral subtractor. So why would you use ducking? You'd want to duck whenever, say if you were doing like a podcast, if you had a bunch of audio and you were doing a mix and you wanted to talk, then you have the ducker set on your mix, and whenever you talk, it turns down your mix. So it's just sidechaining for that. And to Aya's point as well, gated reverb. That is another thing. So these are effects you can do with the gating effects. And to that point as well, gated reverb, and why I even sidechain to a flip gate is because I make trance. I make garage and deep house and shit like that as well. And so I've used those effects on a lot of different house tunes, specifically house. So I learned that specifically from producing house and moving it into my hip hop productions. And I just like the way it cuts, because house is moving really quick, so is drum and bass. So I do both of those effects on both of those styles when I make them. So that's how that works. Again, if you want to go and sidechain, now you have to go and open up your expert. By default, these sidechain will be set to internal. So that means I don't need to self-patch in order to get it to work. I can self-patch twice. I can set it to external, get the self patch running here, use this as a gain knob or even a mix knob, or even mute it. So that's what you can do if you want to do it that way. But internally, it has a gain knob for your left and right channel, and then also a mix knob and a dry knob. And then it allows you to audition. So you can patch anything in here and do that to it. What would I use sidechaining gating in a normal way, a non-flip way? And that would be to lock up sub bass to my resamples. Like if I want my sub bass to, you know, whoopsie, my bad. I am dyslexic, by the way. So I do that a lot. So I probably need like an editor. If you look at any of my patches, a lot of my LFOs are upside down. Just the way I think, dude. I don't know what's wrong with me. Alright, so anyways, that's the Pro G. Really, really simple. Again, gating effects. So Pro C, what we're doing here, exactly the same thing as we were doing before. Except now we have all this stuff in one nice little readout. These are our gradients for our interface. So Pro C has a bunch more functions with this. It's really like, that's its big selling point, is like these different kind of like impulse response like curves in here. That's one of the big things. Also a couple more styles. All right, so clean is the normal way, what we just learned. Threshold, ratio. Notice as this goes to 10 and then exponentially goes up to 100. 100 is limiting. It also has all these snap values, so you can just snap into nice little cuts. So right about here is where I usually start, which is about 3, 4, around there. Classic has a sharper curve, has a harder curve. Clean, more dynamic. Classic, more specific, sharp. Knee right here gives us different curves. So clean and classic are really like the big knee determinants. And then we have opto. Opto is different. Opto doesn't really respond to your ratio. Opto also does natural compression based off of an incoming signal. So it uses your ratio as a reference of how much compression to put on. But opto is an automatic compressor. So exactly, it's perfect for drums. And it says run a lot of stuff through this and we'll shape all of it. So it's like a glue compressor in that regard. It's one of the reasons why I'm not going too deep in the glue compressor, because the glue compressor is really simple. There's really nothing else going on here. Our VU meter is telling us gain reduction. We have these values here, which are based in seconds. So 0.01 equals 10 milliseconds, up to 100, 300, 1 second, 3 seconds, 10, 30. So if you're doing master compression, you probably want to do about 300 milliseconds to a second. So it's not compressing every single peak and distorting. Okay, so all these functions work exactly the same way as it does in here. So this is why I was really harping on this shit, is that you gain a lot of extra functionality here, like a nice little mid-side compressor, side chaining function. So you can compress mid and side in here. And this is where you can change your compressor to a mid-side compressor. Now, Pro C2 should have the gradient function, but a couple extra ones. And I think it might even have a reference function too, just for like other tracks. Why would you compress mid-side? just to kind of lock up with mid-side effects. So like if you have a mid-side kick and doing a bunch of mid-side affecting to your kick, maybe you want to go and sidechain just to the side, in order to get more of the transient. So two different options there. So Pro C2 is literally just a more amplified version of this, but essentially every compressor will work like this. And that's what really you want to get the understanding of. It's like even if you go into isotope, and this is like one thing I just kind of wanted to introduce today because this is a huge part of my production. Not 7. This is just one I'm loading up right now and haven't deleted off my computer. But exactly the same way as well, these would be considered classic compressors because they have the hard knee and an adjustable knee. But these switch into expansion as well, so multiply by 10 below the threshold and above. So just everything gets expanded. Then it has a limiter built into it as well. So I can smash and limit inside of one band. Huge. So essentially, OTT is this. What you're looking right here is OTT. What you don't understand is that OTT is a process. It's not a plugin. It's called OTT because it was literally, the plugin itself was designed after Xfer's OTT. And it's an upward-downwards compressor. That's what OTT is. And Xfer's OTT is, honestly, in my opinion, unusable. Because it just doesn't have any threshold functions. I don't understand what they were thinking not updating that. Because it could be a very, very, very good plugin. So we have all those functions here. We have all those functions here. And here we have more stuff. Say like linear phase crossovers. Before, multiband dynamics didn't have very good crossovers and everything was kind of phasey. So if you're using a ton of stuff. Oh yeah. You are right, bruh. Other way around. But Xfer's OTT does not have as much functionality as this. So I much prefer this. Even when I'm in other DAWs, I don't use Xfer's just because I don't like being limited to those functions of just having this knob. This is pretty much all you have control of. You have some like input and output functions, but you really only have control of the time knob. Yeah, I mean it's good. It crushes your shit. That's really like the point of it. And so like the OTT function in here, like by default, is crushing by default. So by default, I trim all this shit up. I pull some of this back. Might even push the mids a little bit more because they scoop it as well. It's like to pull these a little bit more balanced and pull this down. Might even push this up a little bit so it's not crushed as much. So this is what I do when I load up the multiband. Hold down Command to trim all. Hold down Option to trim one band. Yes. You can do the same thing in Trash 2 as well. So all those all-in-one suites by Isotope will have all of this multiband shit in it. So you can do it in Neutron. You can do it in Alloy. You can do it pretty much anything that has this. So you can also do it in all of the Waves things as well. So like HComp. HComp is probably one of my favorite compressors from Waves. And this is kind of like a bus compressor like SSL. Except it's like a general one. Oof. And just listen to all that hiss. I turn off that stuff by default. But essentially this is exactly the same as this guy. The Cytomics glue compressor is like the one I believe based off of, I think the SSL 5000 or 9000 or one of those. That's probably one of the better ones. HComp is like that as well. So HComp is a good option for that, for glue